Hello, welcome to Classical Greek Latin. This is Greek lesson number 11 for Crosby and Schaeffer, chapter 9. And today we are going to be covering the future, indicative active, and also the infinitive of omega verbs. So this is a pretty straightforward lesson. The lesson in a nutshell is you add a sigma to the present to make it future, and you use the infinitive and indirect discourse. And that's basically the lesson in a nutshell. But let's talk about that just real quickly. So if you may remember from our earlier lessons about the evolution of phonetics, right, or phonemes. So we have, or sounds, put it in English word, right? So when you you add a sigma to the root or the stem of a verb to make it future tense, okay? So let's look at that real quick. So we'll look at our sample verb here, right? We have powell. Now, we have added a sigma here, and that has made this future, right? So first of all, note you have the same endings as on the present tense, okay? So far we have learned the present tense and the imperfect tense, okay? So these are the endings from the present tense, o, es, e, omen, ete, usi, with a movable nu. These are the same personal endings, I, you, he, we, y'all, they, on the present tense as on the future tense. The only difference is that you add a sigma between the stem of the word. In this case, it's stop, I stop. So pau, and before you get to so that's the root, that's the stem of the verb, to the stopping idea. And before you tell who's doing it, I, with the omega, you're going to add sigma between the stem and the personal ending. And then that makes it future. So instead of saying I stop, it now says I will stop. Okay? So you remember also the imperfect, we added the augment, and then we added different personal endings. All right, so let's review that real quick. Okay, so yeah, let's take a look here. We pull out my Greek Paradigm Handbook. This is just for review. Okay. So here we have the present indicative active, all right? This handbook uses lu, to loosen, to destroy, as its verb, sample verb. But that's the same idea as pau, just the same personal ending. So present tense, o, es, e, omen, ete, usi. This is present tense, right? I loose. And then we also learned the imperfect. So let's flip over to that real quick. The next page is the imperfect. So we've learned that, where you add the augment on the front, epsilon, with always a smooth breathing. And then the imperfect or secondary personal endings, right? On, es, e, omen, ete, on. And you remember the third person plural is the same as the first person singular, and context is the only thing that tells us which is which, okay? And then today we're learning the future. So we'll flip the page some more. And then here's the future with a different verb here. And the only thing that we've done is added the sigma, right? But it's the same as the present, just with the sigma added, okay? It uses the primary endings, omega, o, es, e, omen, ete, usi, opposed to the secondary, like for the imperfect, on, es, e, omen, ete, on. All right? So with that being said, we may come back to the handbook after a while. Let's look at what happens when you get verbs like pempo, or ago, or athroizo, which is really athroid in disguise with a zeta. All right? So what happens is you still add the sigma, but because the labials, in this case, p, beta, phi, it's hard to pronounce those three sounds separately from a sigma without it starting to sound like a psi. right? So the sound sounds like a psi. The Greeks wrote a symbol for that sound so that when you have a P for like pimp, so P epsilon mu P, that's the root of this word. When you add that sigma after that last P before you get the omega, it combines with the labial P to give you psi. Okay? So, and the same thing happens with ago, and I'll show you a cross diagram of the human vocal tract here in a second to help solidify this idea. But ago, palatal, roof of your mouth, back of your tongue goes to the roof of your mouth, right? Gamma, gamma, same place as kappa, same place as kappa or chi, just with a little variation. So when you combine it with sigma, it becomes xi, right? So when you see pimps, you don't see a sigma there, but you know a sigma was added to it because you know what the first principal part looked like. All right, so you know that's a future because you know a sigma was inserted there, even though it morphed into a psi here because of the labial, and then a xi here because of the palatal. Okay, labial just means lips, palatal just means like upper part or roof, the roof of your mouth. And then here, a throiso for dentals, okay, and we'll talk about these notes, but zeta is usually indicative that this is not the actual root, athrois, with the zeta there. The actual root is usually athroid with a delta, okay? So, we'll come back to zeta, delta here in a second. But yeah, in a case of a dental, tau, delta, theta, it just drops out completely, and the sigma stays. Or you could even say that the dental gets sucked into the sigma because they're both behind the teeth, right? A sigma is a sibilant behind the teeth. Same place as a dental here. But let's look at the cross diagram of the human vocal tract, and it'll make more sense, a little bit more sense. Okay, so let me zoom out here. All right, so we have the human vocal tract here. All right, so we have the vocal cords down here. This is going to be your tongue, right? And your lower teeth, top teeth, and your upper lip, lower lip. Okay, so this is, the lips are going to be your labials. Okay, let me get a darker pen. So labials are going to be on the lips, right? Your palatal going to be the roof of the mouth right there. Okay. And then your dentals are going to be behind your top teeth. All right. So again, dent just means teeth. Palate just means upper or roof of the mouth, right? And labial just means lips, right? So your P, your beta, and your phi are going to be your labials because they all P, beta, phi. Phi, you put your top teeth on your lower lip, but it's still a labial. Okay, those are the ones that change to psi. Okay. So those become psi. And then your dentals are going to be let's do this in order. Your palatals are going to be your kappa, your gamma, and your chi. Okay. And again, kappa, gamma, back of the tongue goes to the roof of the mouth. Same exact place. The only difference between a kappa and a gamma is that kappa is voiceless. That is, your vocal cords are not vibrating to make a sound. It's just percussive in your mouth. Whereas ga, same place as the kappa, but now your vocal cords, your vocal folds are vibrating. Right? And then chi is basically voiceless. Same place as kappa and gamma, except you're blowing air through it to give it that rough aspirated sound, ki. But it's all going to be a palatal, right? All right, so those are your palatals, and those become xi. All right, So let's clarify that. So plus sigma, and then we'll say plus sigma there, okay? So your dentals are going to be tau, delta, and theta, all right? And then that's going to be, when you add a sigma to that, it's just going to be sigma. All right, and that's because a sigma, make a T sound, delta sound, theta, it's all happening with the tip of the tongue behind the top teeth here, which is the same place that a sigma is made. It's sibilant, right? It's just pressing air, that hissing sound through the top of the teeth. So you could say, it doesn't matter how you think of it, if the tau, delta, theta gets sucked into the sigma sound, or if it just disappears and you're left with the sigma by itself. The reason that is because they're virtually in the same place in the mouth. There's not enough room. There's not enough room for the two of us in this town, right? So everything's happening there, so it's just going to be the sigma there, which is here. You have the labial combined with the sigma becomes a psi, and then here you have a palatal combined with a sigma, which becomes a xi. Okay. All right. I think that makes sense. Let's go on. All right, so let's talk about principal parts real quick. So in Greek, in Latin, let's talk about Latin for a second. So in Latin, you have 4 principal parts, right? If you're taking our Latin lessons on our YouTube channel, our sample verb for first conjugation is laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatus. So 4 principal parts there. Greek has 6. So today we are learning the second principal part, though we have learned now 3 tenses, okay? So the first principal part, so this is a dictionary entry with only the first 2 principal parts, right? If you look this word up in the lexicon, there will be 4 more additional principal parts, and we'll look up a word here in a second, okay? This is just the first 2. On the first principal part, you have pemp, and almost always you can find the root of a verb from the first principal part, right? So that's what everything else is built upon, that root, right? So the root here is pemp, p, epsilon, mu, p, and then you add the sigma to that root to make it future. All right, so you have pempo here, I send, present tense. If you were to add an augment to this root, epsilon, and change it to a secondary ending, on, epempon, I was sending, right? So those are 2 tenses, present and imperfect, which we've learned. And now today we're learning the third tense that we're learning is the future. It constitutes the second principal part, and all that we have done is added a sigma to the first principal part and made the second principal part. Okay? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about all right, let's talk about this double tau here. Okay, so what they're talking about is this. I said you can always tell a stem or root of a principal part. You can always tell the stem, the root of a verb, from the first principal part. Okay, that is not true with a verb that has a double tau in its first principal part. Let me show you what I mean by that. We're going to use the word tasso, tato. Let me just pull out my other lexicon real quick, and I'll show you what I'm talking about here. All right, so let's look at tasso here. So this is a Liddell Scott Jones intermediate sized lexicon. Very good lexicon. It provides you the root, but you would be able to figure out the root on your own. Okay, so we have tasso here, which means to arrange or set in order, right? This is the word we get syntax from. Okay. So we are learning Attic Greek. Greek from Attica near Athens, which is the Greek which Aristotle and Plato used. All right, so tasso, it comes from a different dialect of Greek, but it is the same verb as to. Now the point here is the double tau. Okay, so that in this lexicon, like any lexicon, they're going to give you the 6 principal parts here, right? So you have the first principal part here with an alternate spelling of the double tau, double sigma, very common. Okay, very interchangeable. The double sigma, double tau, almost always it's just the same word with a different spelling. Then they give you the future, second principal part, aorist, third principal part, perfect, fourth principal part, and so on, right? They give you all 6 principal parts there. So if we go to the second principal part, the future, toxo, I will set in order, or I will arrange, we would expect it to be tasso, because dentals drop out before sigmas. And we know that we added a sigma here to the root of this verb to make it future. So why is it xi, as if the last letter of the root of this verb was a palatal? Okay, so this is one of those verbs where you cannot get the root of the verb from the first principal part. Now the first principal part is how we build the present tense and in the imperfect tense, right? So this is correct for the present, right? I arrange. So it'd be tasso, tasses, tasse, tassomen, tassete, tassusi. But because of looking at the future, we have xi here, which is indicative of a palatal, roof of your mouth, consonant added to a sigma, or sigma added to a palatal. We know it's going to be a palatal. Okay, so it could have been tak, it could have been tak, or it could have been tag. This lexicon, Liddell Scott Jones, tells us the root of this word is actually tag. Okay, so it's not taught, it's not toss, as you would think. As is typical, the first principal part usually tells you the root. This case, the double sigma, double tau, is going to be indicative of a palatal in the root. So tag, tau, alpha, gamma, is the actual root of this verb. And you see that in the future, and then also the aorist, which we'll get into all that later, and then the perfect. But the root is tag, not toss, not taught. Okay? All right. So I hope that clarifies that for you, right? So that is when they're talking about the double tau here are palatals, okay? In most sentences, the stem is readily recognized in the present tense, but verbs with the stems in tau, double tau or double sigma, are palatals, and most verbs with the stems in zeta, like athroizo, athroiz, are dentals, right? Athroid. So the original is a delta here, which is going to drop out in front of a sigma to make the future athroiso. Athroiso. Okay. All right. In case of doubt, consult the general vocabulary at the back of the book. All right. So let's see here. Let's look at the dictionary entry for tato and Crosby and Schaeffer's dictionary lexicon here. All right, so yeah, here it is. So we were just looking at Liddell Scott Jones. If you can get a copy of Liddell Scott Jones, it is a phenomenal lexicon. But Crosby Schaeffer's lexicon back here is much more to the point, much more simplified for us beginners. And let's see here. But yeah, so we looked at Tasso and Liddell Scott Jones, and Crosby Schaeffer, they just jump straight to the Attic formation of this word tato, right? And this is more straightforward at your future, your aorist, your perfect, and so on. Right, so first principal part, in this case, double tau, you can't get the root from that. You don't know what it is until you get to here. Tox, okay, it's going to be tog. Tog, palatal is going to be the root, which makes sense here. Moving forward, you have all these palatals. There's the true root right there. To tog, my. All right. let's not get too much in the weeds on that. Okay, so, and let's talk about the infinitive real quick. All right, so like I said, the infinitive is just like the present tense. You just add that sigma between the root of the word, the root of the verb, and the infinitive ending, right? So instead of pauein, you have pausein. Very straightforward there. And select these, okay. You can do this practice on your own. Let's go to indirect discourse. All right, so indirect discourse, I'm not a big fan of technical terms like this, as you know. Basically, indirect discourse happens when you have the main subject like thinking or talking, describing a secondary action of another subject. So you have two subjects. You have the person saying something. That's an action. He's saying or speaking or thinking something, right? And then you have what he is like inside of his thought, the action that's going on in that thought. Okay. So the sample they give over here is the general, right? So I have this in an English example here. So let's talk about this real quick. We'll come back to Crosby Schaeffer in a second. All right, so let's say, cover that up for a second. Let's say you have this idea, the general sends, right? So you have your subject, nominative subject, the general, and then you have the action that he is doing in the third person singular to correspond to the subject, right? The subject is third person, the general, and he's singular, right? And this is the action that he's doing. He sends, so that is singular. Okay, that's typical. That's good Greek. That's good grammar. What an indirect discourse does is it introduces a primary subject, namely nominative subject, that is talking about, describing the action of the general. And that's going to change things up a little bit. Okay, so what happens so nomizo is the verb we're using today. I think, right? So I would be the nominative subject now. Okay, so this is an action by itself. I think, and then what am I thinking? That is, you could say, what is the direct object of my thinking? It is this whole action of the general, right? So this whole phrase now becomes the object of the thinking. And therefore, the general is, even though he is the one sending, we are thinking about him sending. So we're going to put him in the accusative case because he is the direct object, if you will, of the thinking, of my thinking. So I think, what am I thinking? I'm thinking of the general sending. So he's going to be the direct object of my thinking. And now his action, because he's no longer in the nominative case. So a finite verb like person with personal ending, os, a, I, you, he, this case third person singular, pempe, for sends, needs a nominative subject for that verb. But we've changed the general into accusative to be the direct object of my thinking. But the general still needs to do his sending. So how does that work? We're going to put sends into the infinitive. Okay? So it's going to be pempein in our sample here in English. It's going to be pempein, right? Instead of pempe. Right? So it's going to be infinitive. So I think the general in the direct object, because I'm thinking of him doing his thing, he is sending, right? So I think of him in the direct object, the accusative, and to send, right? And we'll look at the Greek examples here in Crosby Schaeffer. He gives some good examples. But rather than just memorize this arbitrary finite personal verb in the original statement, and then an accusative subject with an infinitive verb and the indirect discourse, you have to understand why, the logic behind it, rather than just memorize it. Okay, that'll make Greek more fun and less miserable, and easier too. All right, so let's look here. Let's read through this a little bit. So in Latin, the main verb, okay, Latin and Greek often similar. In Latin, the main verb is the quoted statement is always infinitive. Okay, they're talking about what the general is doing, right? The same construction is frequently found in Greek. Okay, I give us a note here. But in Greek, other constructions appear depending on the introductory verb. We'll get to that later. Let's just read this. In Latin, the subject of the infinitive is in indirect discourse is always accusative. Okay, we talked about that. The same is true for Greek, unless the infinitive has the same subject as the introductory verb. Okay, and we'll talk about that in the sample that he gives us here. In which case, the subject of the infinitive is omitted, and any word in agreement with that unexpressed subject is nominative. Okay. Okay, so here we go. So I think the general to pursue, and in English we would translate I think the general will pursue. This is future, right? So I think that the general will pursue. Okay, so I'm thinking about him as a direct object, but he's got to also doing something, so the action that he's going to do is going to be in the infinitive, in this case future infinitive. All right, now here, so we have first person in the thinking verb I, and then we have third person singular, the general, the guy over there, as the subject in the indirect discourse. Okay, so this can be with nomizo, with saying, speaking, dreaming, thinking, like here. Anything that's like an imaginary kind of action that you're imagining a second action with that action, you're imagining or saying a second action. Okay, it's going to have this construction. All right, here, the exception we're talking about up here, with the subject being the same, if nomizo, dioxane, right? So there's no accusative direct object of the nomizo, so the implication is that the subject is the same, namely I. So I think I shall pursue, right? So you could be redundant here, and you could put ego here for first person singular nominative, right? Nomizo ego dioxane, right? In which case the subject of the infinitive is omitted, and any word in agreement with that unexpressed subject is nominative, right? It's already implied that I am the subject of both the thinking and the pursuing and chasing, so we don't have to state it, okay, as a nominative ego. It's implied, okay? But if we were to state it, to be redundant, it would be nominative there, because the subject of that secondary verb is the same as the subject of the first verb, namely here I, myself. When the subject is different, the subject of the second verb, here general, of the second verb, dioxin, the first verb is nomizo, he's going to be direct object of the thinking verb, even though he's the subject of the action of dioxin. Okay. I'm hoping this makes sense for you. If you have questions or comments, put those in the comments below, and I will try to get to those. And also, we have a Patreon page. The link for that is in the description. It's $10 a month, and we go over the exercises at the back of each chapter and go over the grammar in more detail. If you think that may be of help to you or you're interested in that, check out that link. Okay, go on to D. The tense of the infinitive in the quoted statement, regardless of the tense of the introductory verb, is the same as that used in the original statement. May sound complicated, very straightforward though, right? All right, we'll skip that first line. So nomize, he thinks the enemy to pursue. So he thinks, present indicative active, third person singular. Diokin, present infinitive active, so it's present, right? So he thinks the enemy are pursuing. He thinks present in English, are pursuing present in English. This is where it gets a little weird, what this comment is talking about. Enomize, so he was thinking, this is in third person singular, imperfect indicative active. He was thinking that the enemy, Theo, came. Now this is present tense. This is present indicative, or excuse me, this is present infinitive active, but it's present tense. But this is imperfect. So this present infinitive verb is going to be subjected to the tense of this imperfect main verb in the original thinking, saying, imagining, introductory to this phrase, right? So he thought, imperfect translation of enomize, imperfect verb, he thought that the enemy were pursuing, translated as imperfect to match the imperfect here, even though it's actually present tense. Okay? That's what paragraph D is talking about. Okay? So just let that settle in for a minute. And if it feels confusing or a little weird, you'll get used to it. All right, let's look at the vocab here. So make sure there's nothing too weird. All right, so now I've talked about there are 6 principal parts to a verb. Here they're going to give us the first 2 principal parts because that's what we have learned so far. Now if we go to our Greek Paradigm Handbook, let me just show you this real quick. It lists the 6 principal parts of all the verbs. So this is what we've learned so far. The present and imperfect tenses are built on the first principal part. The future is built on the second principal part. So this is what we've learned so far. Okay? And this is what we will be learning in future chapters. All right. But that's why you have 2 words there for the verb. Now, when you're doing your flashcards, let's see here. All right, so we'll go mellow. So I've written these flashcards out, and for the verbs now, I'm left justifying them because I've got to leave room to add my other 4 principal parts when we learn those later on in future chapters. All right, so if you're making flashcards, I recommend flashcards. That's what I recommend. All right, there's, again, dioko, dioxo, and I'm leaving room for the other 4 principal parts when they do come. All right. Okay, so let's see here. Okay, yeah, so that's the present, or the present and then the future. Thura, as, the alpha is there instead of an eta because of the rho. Remember, epsilon iota rho in a noun or adjective makes the eta change to an alpha. All right. You still have the eta for the direct, for the definite article. All right, here we have an adjective, iskuros, os aon. Again, the a is there because of the rho instead of an eta. And then you have, oh, this is interesting. We didn't talk about this. All right, so mello. Okay, I intend to delay, or I intend, I delay, requires a infinitive, usually with a future infinitive, right? Because the idea of intending, you're intending to do something in the future. But what I want to point out here is the insertion of this eta here, and that is because you have a lambda, which is a liquid. Rho and lambda are both liquids, and what that just means is they are an imprecise sound. So they're hard to conform, they're hard to morph, right? So it's hard to combine a lambda with a sigma, and the Greeks really saw it as impossible. So they couldn't just drop the lambdas to have the sigma, right? So when you insert a sigma, it usually changes the letters before it, right? Unless they're vowels. But you can't combine a lambda with a sigma in the Greek mouth. But if you were to eliminate the lambdas, then you would eliminate the root of the word here, the verb, and then it would be incoherent. You wouldn't know what it was saying, right? Is it just men? Is it me? So you got to keep the lambdas. They won't combine with the sigma. So the Greeks inserted an eta to separate them. And that's all that is, right? So it's the eta here is just separating the lambda from the sigma, because the lambdas can't drop out, but they can't combine with the sigma, right? So the eta gets put in there to make it meleso, which is still future, right? So it'd still be meleso, meleses, melese, and so on, all right? So melo, I intend, I will intend. And that eta is just there really as a placeholder to separate lambda and sigma, okay? Nomizo, they're going to provide us the future tense of that later on. That's what the note says, because it gets kind of complicated. Hodos, masculine appearance, but actually a feminine noun. Typically, this happens the other way around, where it has a feminine appearance with a masculine gender. Here it's the reverse. Masculine appearance, os, u, right? So it's going to follow the masculine declension, right? Os, u, o, on, and so on. But it has a feminine direct definite article. I keep wanting to say direct instead of definite. Definite article here. So it is feminine, right? Road. Let's see here. The book of Exodus, the road out in the Bible. That's where that word comes from. All right, petho, peso. Again, they're giving us the first and second principal parts of the verb. 4 more principal parts to follow in future chapters. And then here, they separate hoop from opteuo, because they're telling you that these are 2 words from hupo and then opteuo, right? So you can look up opteuo in the lexicon, and it will have its own dictionary. It will have its own lexical entry. And then hoop, opteuo, will also have its own lexical entry. Okay, pretty straightforward. Let's talk about the exercises real quick. All right, so for exercise A, what they're basically asking you to do is to parse. Basically tell me what this is, and let's do it together. So pempsusi, it is going to be third person plural, usi, and it is future, psi. We knew a sigma was added there to the root of this verb, which is pemp. So this is future indicative active. So that's it. So you parse it, third person plural, future indicative active, and then they want you to write the corresponding forms of the present, right? So we'd go back to the present form of this. We want to put the present in third person plural, so it'd be usi, and then make it present, it would be pemp. So it'd be pempusi instead of pempsusi. Okay, so parse the verb they give you, and then write the corresponding form that is same person, same number in the present tense. Okay, so let me write this down for you. So pempsusi would become pempusi. All right, and that is third person plural, present indicative active. Okay, that's that section. Section B is simple translation. All right, and again, we will cover all this on Patreon. If you'd like the answers to help you out with your work, look at the link in the description below for that. And then here we're completing as usual. If it's a verb, put the correct verbal ending on, which makes the most sense in the sentence. And if it's a noun or adjective, put the correct case ending on it to make sense, the most sense, right? So ton here, strate gon, right? It's going to be accusative singular masculine there. So he's going to be the direct object, but you get the idea. All right. So that's that. Let's flip the page real quick. Then we have section D. Take the English that they've given you and write it in Greek. Okay, again, we'll cover this on Patreon. Word formation, I will not be covering this on Patreon. This is just for your personal enrichment. It talks about how vowel shift, right? Like in English, we have sing, sang, song. Greek does something similar here for lepo, right? I leave, versus loibos, right? Or lego, I speak, versus logos, which is word, right? So you have the verb here, and then you have the noun, and the vowel shifts to make that difference. Okay, that's that. And then our next Greek lesson, we'll be covering the first aorist, which is probably the most common tense in Greek. But that is this week's lesson, Greek lesson number 11 for Crosby and Schaeffer, chapter 9. And we covered the future indicative active today and the future infinitive active, and also indirect discourse. All right, thanks for joining us today. I hope you have found that helpful. Put comments, questions in the comments below. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share if you so desire. And we will see you next time. Until then, have a good rest of your week. Thank you. Bye.